Running out of energy can be a real nightmare. It can happen to anybody, and you have to be careful to avoid it. And building your endurance to ride for a long time is obviously a good way to do that. It might seem like a good idea to build up your pace and your endurance, so ride fast maybe every weekend, try and ride a fast long ride every weekend. But in my experience, that's not the best way to do it. The best way is to keep things separate, so build your endurance separately from your speed. And this works quite nicely if you're working during a normal working week. It means you can build your endurance at the weekend. It's quite enjoyable to do a nice, easy, gentle ride at the weekend, and build your speed during the week when you've got a bit less time, and you can go on the indoor trainer and do some really structured, faster sessions. So what's the best way to do that? Well, have some clear objectives. Build yourself a training plan. Start your training plan at a duration or a distance. It's best to work actually with duration, because in cycling the weather can have such a big impact. Or if you want to do different routes, hilly routes are slower than flat routes. But if you ride for a duration, maybe 4 hours, if you know you can ride for 4 hours at your endurance pace, if you've set your training zones, your training zone 2 or your training zone 1, at a pace that's really comfortable, a conversational pace is a good way to describe it. Ride for 4 hours and then build up half an hour a week or an hour a week. Actually, it's better to build up in steps because your fitness seems to develop in steps. Pace is the most important thing to bear in mind. If you go too fast, you're more likely to struggle because you're going above that aerobic threshold. Your body has to use up its glycogen reserves, and as a consequence, you run out of energy and you hit the wall. You have to slow down to below what's known as your aerobic threshold. So be careful of your pacing. Don't get drawn into riding too hard. If you're out with friends, this is a really risky situation because if they're fitter than you, they might egg you on to ride too fast, or you might feel that you're holding them back. Don't worry about it. Most people are quite happy to wait and have a chat. And if they don't like it, well, you're probably better off without them. So ride at your own pace and develop your own fitness and your own endurance. And if you do this gradually, soon you might even be riding faster than these people that you're struggling to keep up with. If you're lucky enough to have a power meter, or rich enough to buy a power meter, then certainly recommend it. Working with power is definitely the most effective way to train. Use that to measure your pace. You notice if you do ride with power, a lot of people ride harder on climbs and then relax on downhills, and that's not the best way to develop your endurance. The best way to develop is to ride at a fairly constant power, and then you're not going up and down. You're not using those precious glycogen reserves by going above you aerobic threshold on the climbs and then trying to recover, because you don't recover your glycogen reserves until you've eaten quite a lot of food, and carbohydrates replenish your glycogen reserves, and they take a couple of days to replenish completely. If you don't have a power meter, you can use what's known as perceived exertion, or you can use your heart rate. So if you wear a heart rate monitor, you can check whether your heart rate's going higher when you're doing climbs. Obviously, if you're only doing short climbs, your heart rate won't change because it takes a time to lag. Your heart rate lags behind actual effort, which is one of the reasons that power meters are so good. But if you're doing longer climbs over a couple of minutes, you can keep an eye on your heart rate monitor. I'm looking at a wrist because a lot of people have a watch-based heart rate monitor, but some people have them on the bars. Normal cycle computers are on the bars, and have that set to just 1 or 2 values that are important to you, maybe heart rate or just power, heart rate and power. I set mine to heart rate, power and cadence, which is quite nice because it means that you can keep an eye on whether you're pedaling at a sensible cadence. And also think about your perceived exertion. What does it feel like? What you can often feel is, once you've been cycling for a while, is you can start to understand what it's like to go above your endurance training zone, go above that training zone 2, and you feel like you're breathing a little bit harder. It's just you start to get a perception that things are going a bit too fast. And then you just need to back off and not get carried away. And in that way, you can ride for longer and build that endurance much more quickly. I've mentioned aerobic threshold quite a lot, and it might be useful to check out one of my other videos on aerobic threshold. I'll link it in the end screen. Most people point, so I don't know, it's up there, or down there, or somewhere like that. And also we've written a blog on a website, so you could have a look at that if you want. There's one on aerobic threshold. It's quite popular, endurancebikerun.com, and I can link that in the description if you want to have a look at it. And also, if you like these videos, please like and subscribe. Eating and drinking properly is really important. So a good way to get some energy into your system is to use a drink mix, an energy type drink that gives you electrolytes and carbohydrates, and then you're getting the energy from the carbohydrates. The electrolytes help your hydration process, as does the carbohydrate, and these really make a big difference. If you aim to drink maybe up to 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, depending on the intensity that you're riding at, then you'll be significantly able to ride for longer. It makes a big difference to how long you can ride for and how comfortable you are. When you get back, and if you have a heart rate monitor and a power meter, or even if you don't have a power meter, you can look at your pace. Analyze your data, have a look at the long rides, because the data that's from your long rides is really useful. And the most useful thing perhaps to look for is any drift. So if you can ride at a fairly constant power or pace, I mean, pace isn't quite as good, because if you're riding out into the wind and then back with the wind, or vice versa, which is obviously much more unpleasant, then the pace isn't as meaningful. But if you have a power meter, then you can say, well, I've ridden this ride in the middle of my zone 2, whatever that might be, 160 watts. And then if you look at combine that with the heart rate trace, you can see whether your heart rate stays the same, and you can look for this decoupling, which things like training peaks will give you an idea of P. If you look in the summary, it is P colon heart rate or something like that, and that will tell you how much it's drifting. And what it is the difference between the first half of the ride and the second half of the ride, and the percentage difference between those two values. If it's above 5%, then it shows that you perhaps need to spend a bit more time trying to adapt at that power and duration. If it's below 5%, then you can assume that you're reasonably well adapted, and that's the time to build up the duration. You can also look at your cadence, and if you look at the cadence trace, then as you get fatigued, you notice that it starts to get more spiky. You might, because the reason that shows up is that's when you started to get out of the saddle quite often, or it's hard to maintain a good cadence when you get tired. So what often happens, your cadence slows down, you start getting out of the saddle and standing up and sitting down, and things become a lot more varied rather than having a nice smooth cadence. So in summary, have a clear plan. Analyze your data when you get back from your rides and see whether things are going to plan, whether it's time to push things a little bit further. If you're riding 4 hours for 3 weeks, it might be time to ride for 5 hours, or if it's not time, if you're still getting that heart rate drift, or you're still feeling really tired at the end of the ride, then it may be not time to increase the duration. Remember, pacing is really important, so be careful of overdoing that pace. The important thing is to ride for a long time, ride for as long as possible at a sensible pace. Obviously, you don't want to be riding incredibly slowly, so it's not, I realise that it's like how long's a piece of string, but if you can ride in your endurance zone 2 for a long period of time, that's probably a good rule of thumb. And that might be your event pace if you're doing an ultra endurance event. And that's it. Just pace it appropriately, feed yourself properly, drink properly, and let me know how you get on.